The day Matilda Redmond stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Texas, with nothing but a cracked leather suitcase, 32 cents, and a letter of employment that turned out to be 3 months old, she made herself one solemn promise. She would not cry in front of strangers. She nearly broke that promise within the first 10 minutes. The town of Dusty Creek sat baking under the relentless July sun of 1878, a cluster of weathered wooden buildings pressed between two low hills, as if the land itself was trying to swallow them. The main street was nothing more than a wide river of dust that billowed up around horses' hooves and wagon wheels and clung to everything it touched. There was a general store, a livery stable, a barber shop with a cracked red and white pole, a saloon called the Copper Penny, and a small white church at the far end of the street that leaned slightly to the left as if exhausted by the heat. Matilda stood at the edge of the boardwalk and read the letter again, although she had already memorized every word of it. Mrs. Alois Hargrove, proprietress of the Dusty Creek Hotel, had written to the employment agency in San Antonio advertising for a housekeeper. That letter had been written in April. By the time the agency forwarded it to Matilda in late June, and by the time Matilda had packed her things and scraped together fare for the 3-day journey, Mrs. Hargrove had already hired someone else. The woman herself had told Matilda this with genuine regret, her round face creased with sympathy under a wide-brimmed bonnet. She had even offered Matilda a cup of water, which Matilda accepted because her throat was so dry she felt as though she had swallowed half the road. "I am terribly sorry, dear," Mrs. Hargrove had said. "You came all this way. If I had known the agency would take so long, I would have written to warn you." Matilda had smiled and thanked her and walked back out into the street, and now she stood there with the sun bearing down on the crown of her dark hair, trying to think clearly. She was 24 years old. She had grown up on a small farm outside of Abilene until a drought took it from her family when she was 17. Her father had died 2 years after that, more of a broken heart than any physical ailment, her mother always said. Her mother had passed the following winter. Since then, Matilda had worked as a seamstress, a laundress, a kitchen helper, and a schoolteacher's assistant, moving from town to town across Texas as work allowed and as circumstances required. She was not fragile. She was not the kind of woman who gave in easily to despair. But standing there in Dusty Creek with 32 cents and no plan, she felt something very close to it pressing against the back of her eyes. "You look like someone who just got some bad news." The voice came from her left, slow and unhurried, the way someone talks when they are not in any particular rush to be anywhere. Matilda turned to see a man leaning against the post of the barber shop, one boot crossed over the other at the ankle, holding a tin cup of coffee. He was tall and lean with the kind of tan that only comes from years of outdoor work, and he wore a plain gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows. His hat was pushed back on his head just enough that she could see his face clearly. He had dark eyes, an honest jaw, and a look about him that was neither unfriendly nor intrusive. He appeared to be somewhere in his late 20s, perhaps 28 or 29, and there was a quietness to him that Matilda noticed immediately, the way you notice the absence of wind. "I got a letter from a hotel that had already filled the position it advertised," Matilda said, because she had always believed that honest answers saved time. The man nodded as though this did not surprise him. "Mrs. Hargrove's place, that is the one." He straightened up from the post and took a slow sip of his coffee. "You came from a ways off." "San Antonio," Matilda said, 3 days by stage." Something shifted in his expression, a slight tightening around the eyes that might have been sympathy or might have been something he was working out. "Chester Ellsworth," he said, and he extended his free hand. Matilda looked at the hand for a brief moment, then shook it. "Matilda Redmond. Do you have somewhere to stay tonight, Miss Redmond?" "Not at the present moment, no." Chester Ellsworth looked down the street toward the general store, then back at her. "My aunt runs the bakery on 2nd Street. It is not on the main road, but it is the cross street just past the livery. Her name is Ruth Ellsworth. She is a plain-spoken woman, but she is good, and she sometimes takes in boarders when she has the extra room. You might ask her." Matilda studied him for a moment. He was not being forward. There was nothing in his voice or manner that suggested anything other than a straightforward piece of practical information offered to someone who clearly needed it. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, not suspiciously, but genuinely. Chester seemed to think about that for a moment. "Because you are standing in the street in the middle of July with a suitcase," he said, "and because Dusty Creek is not the kind of place where a woman on her own should be standing without anywhere to go." That was all. He finished his coffee, set the cup down on the edge of the barbershop windowsill, touched the brim of his hat, and walked away down the street with that same unhurried stride. Matilda picked up her suitcase and went to find 2nd Street. Ruth Ellsworth was exactly as her nephew had described her. She was a stout woman in her mid-50s with flour on her apron and a no-nonsense manner that Matilda found enormously comforting after the exhausting uncertainty of the day. She looked Matilda up and down for approximately 3 seconds, then said, "Can you bake?" "Well enough," Matilda said. "How much money do you have?" Matilda saw no point in pretending. 32 cents. Ruth pressed her lips together. "I have a room upstairs, small but clean. You can earn your keep helping me in the bakery until you find steadier work. I will not charge you for the first week. After that, we discuss arrangements. Is that agreeable?" "Very agreeable," Matilda said, and this time she very nearly did cry, but she managed to hold it together by fixing her attention on the row of fresh loaves cooling on Ruth's counter and breathing in the warm smell of them, which was the most comforting thing she had encountered in a very long time. The room was indeed small. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, one window that looked out over a small yard where 2 chickens moved around with an air of quiet self-importance, and a wooden peg on the wall for hanging clothes. Matilda set her suitcase down, sat on the edge of the bed, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of private grief for the situation she was in. Then she stood up, washed her face, pinned back her hair, and went downstairs to start helping Ruth prepare the next morning's bread. The following days settled into a rhythm. Matilda rose before dawn to help Ruth with the baking. She carried loaves to the hotel and the general store on a covered tray, learning the lay of the town as she went. Dusty Creek had approximately 340 residents, give or take, and most of them seemed to have a strong opinion about bread. She met the blacksmith, a large, cheerful man named Hector Vasquez, and his wife Carmen, who ran a small herb garden behind their house and occasionally brought Ruth bundles of dried rosemary and thyme in exchange for rolls. She met the sheriff, a weathered man named Abel Prout who said very little and observed everything. She met the schoolteacher, a younger woman named Florence Bray who had come out from Missouri 2 years ago and was still slightly stunned by the vastness of Texas. She did not see Chester Ellsworth for 4 days. When she did see him again, it was at the well in the yard behind the livery stable, which served a block of buildings on the east side of town. She was drawing water for Ruth's wash, working the handle of the pump with steady turns, when she heard the sound of a horse being led into the livery yard and looked up to see Chester coming through the gate leading a bay horse with a slightly uneven gait. "Miss Redmond," he said, pausing. He did not appear surprised to see her. She got the impression that Chester Ellsworth was rarely surprised by things. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said, "I went to see your aunt. Thank you for telling me about her. She treating you fairly. She is treating me very well. She is a remarkable woman." Something warmed in his expression at that, a small but genuine thing. "She is," he agreed. "I was raised partly by her after my mother passed, so I know it." Matilda kept working the pump, filling the wooden bucket. "What happened to your horse?" she asked, nodding toward the bay. "Stone bruise on the left front," Chester said, running his hand down the horse's neck. "Sam at the livery knows how to treat it. I have done it myself before, but I wanted a second pair of eyes on it." He paused. "How are you finding Dusty Creek?" "Smaller than I expected," Matilda said. "But the people are kinder than I feared." "What did you fear?" She set down the full bucket and looked at him directly. That it would be the kind of place where a woman alone draws the wrong kind of attention or the wrong kind of judgment, or both. Chester nodded slowly. There are those here who are not worth much, he said frankly, as there are anywhere, but Dusty Creek has more good people than bad in my experience. How long have you lived here? 6 years. I came down from Colorado after a trail drive and found that I preferred staying in one place. He said it simply, without elaboration, the way people do when they have decided that a thing is settled and do not feel the need to justify it. I have a small ranch about 4 miles east. I raise cattle mostly, some horses. Matilda picked up her bucket. Thank you again for your kindness on the day I arrived. I was not at my best that afternoon. You seemed perfectly steady to me, Chester said, and there was something so matter-of-fact in his tone that she believed he meant it exactly as he said it, with no softening or flattery intended. She walked back to Ruth's bakery and found herself thinking about that for the rest of the afternoon. Over the next 2 weeks, a thing happened so gradually that Matilda might have missed it if she had not been paying a particular kind of attention. Chester Ellsworth appeared in her days with a quiet consistency that she began to notice the way you notice a particular bird song in the morning, not because it demands to be heard, but because of how the silence feels when it is absent. He came into the bakery on a Tuesday to buy bread for the ranch and spent a few minutes talking to Ruth about whether the summer rains would come early or late. He was at the general store when Matilda went to pick up a package of dried yeast for Ruth, and he held the door for her on the way in and the way out. He passed her on the main street one morning when she was making deliveries, and he fell into step beside her long enough to carry the tray to the hotel door, then tipped his hat and went on his way without making a production of it. She noticed that he was a careful observer. He noticed things, small things. He noticed when the wheel on Ruth's delivery cart developed a wobble and fixed it without being asked. He noticed that Matilda walked on the shaded side of the street whenever she could, and one afternoon when he found her waiting for the shade to shift so she could cross to the post office, he simply stood there beside her in companionable silence until the shadow of the building stretched far enough, and then they crossed together. "You do not talk very much," Matilda said to him one afternoon, not as a criticism. "I talk when I have something to say," Chester said. "Most people talk to fill the silence." "Most people are afraid of silence," he said. "I grew up working cattle. You learn that silence is not empty, it is just quiet." Matilda thought about that for a long time afterward. She had been in Dusty Creek for just over 3 weeks when she began to suspect that she might want to stay. Not because she had resolved her situation entirely. She still had no permanent employment, still relied on Ruth's generosity with the room, still had only a modest bit of money set aside from what Ruth had begun paying her for the baking work. But there was something about the rhythm of the place that had begun to feel less like a temporary stop and more like a place where a life could be built. She was not entirely sure what to do with that feeling, so she filed it away and concentrated on the immediate task of getting herself properly established. The immediate task was interrupted on a warm Thursday evening by the arrival of a man named Denton Spar. Denton Spar was the kind of man who took up more space than was rightfully his. He was broad-shouldered and loud, and had the polished confidence of someone who was accustomed to having people step aside for him. He had come to Dusty Creek 2 years ago, Matilda learned from Ruth, and had established himself as the largest landowner in the area, buying up several smaller ranches when their owners could no longer keep up with costs during the hard years. He owned nearly everything between the creek and the southern ridge, and he had a way of talking about Dusty Creek as though it already belonged to him and the people in it were merely tenants. Ruth did not like him. She said so plainly, in the way Ruth said most things. "He comes in here and he always wants something extra at no extra charge," Ruth told Matilda one morning, rolling dough with firm, decisive strokes. "Last month he asked me to hold back 6 loaves every Thursday for his household, and then he sends his man to pick them up, and the man always says Mr. Spar will settle up at the end of the month. The end of the month comes and I see 2/3 of what he owes. I am a bakery, not a lending institution. Have you told him so? Matilda asked. Ruth gave her a look that said this was a slightly naive question. Denton Spar does not respond well to women telling him how things are going to be, she said. He has a way of making things difficult for people who cross him. He controls the water rights on the south side of town. He controls 2 of the 5 seats on the town council. He is not a violent man exactly. He is the kind of man who causes problems with paperwork and pressure rather than his fists. Matilda understood this distinction. She had encountered men like that before. They were, in some ways, more dangerous than the fists variety, because the damage they did was harder to name and harder to defend against. She met Denton Spar in person that same Thursday evening when he came to collect his bread. He walked into the bakery as though he owned it, which Matilda suspected was a habit, and when he found Matilda behind the counter instead of Ruth, he stopped and looked at her with an appraising interest that made her want to take a step backward. "You must be the new girl," he said. He had a rich, warm voice that was probably very persuasive in the right contexts. "Word around town is you came in from San Antonio." "That is correct," Matilda said, and her own voice came out perfectly even, which she was grateful for. "I am Denton Spar," he said, as though she should already know this, which she did. "I have an arrangement with Ruth about bread." "I know about the arrangement," Matilda said. She wrapped the 6 loaves in cloth as Ruth had taught her, set them on the counter, and quoted him the price. Spar smiled at her. It was not an unkind smile exactly, but it had too much ease in it, the smile of a man who expected the world to accommodate him. "Ruth usually lets me settle up at month's end. Mrs. Ellsworth has asked me to collect payment at time of pickup going forward," Matilda said. This was not entirely true. Ruth had not specifically instructed her in this exact scenario, but she had told Matilda that morning that she was tired of the arrangement, and Matilda had simply decided what to do with that information. Spar studied her for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and counted out the money, set it on the counter, picked up his bread, and smiled again. "You have a directness about you, Miss Redmond," Matilda said. "Miss Redmond, I like that." He paused at the door. "I suspect we will be seeing more of each other." He walked out. Matilda collected the money, went to the back room, and told Ruth what had happened. Ruth stood very still for a moment, then said, "Good girl," and went back to her work. That evening at supper, Ruth mentioned the exchange to Chester, who had stopped by to drop off some firewood. Matilda was setting the table, and she watched Chester's face as Ruth told the story. His expression did not change dramatically, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Spar paid in full?" he asked. "Full price, right there on the counter," Ruth said with evident satisfaction. Chester looked at Matilda. "You handled that well." "I simply charged the man for bread," Matilda said. "With Spar, it is never simply anything," Chester said. He did not say it dramatically. It was more like a piece of information being filed in its correct place. That night, Matilda lay in her narrow bed and listened to the soft sounds of the town settling around her, the distant call of a coyote somewhere beyond the hills, the occasional creak of a shutter, the sound of someone's horse shifting in a nearby stable. She thought about Chester's expression when Ruth had told the story. She thought about the way he had said she had handled it well, the plain, unadorned quality of it, no performance, just an honest observation. She thought about how different that was from the polished, studied attention of a man like Denton Spar. She did not sleep for quite some time. August came in with a heat so profound and physical that it felt like a presence in the room. Ruth's bakery started work even earlier to avoid the worst of it, and Matilda found herself out in the pre-dawn darkness with the owls calling from the cottonwood trees, kneading dough by lamplight while the rest of the town slept. She had always had a complicated relationship with early mornings. She did not love them, but she had developed a respect for them over the years, for their privacy and their particular quality of silence. It was on one of these early mornings, about a week into August, that she heard a sound that did not belong to the sleeping town. It was a voice, low and urgent, from somewhere near the alley beside the bakery. She stood very still for a moment, listening, and then recognized that it was not threatening. It was a woman's voice, talking quietly with a thread of distress running through it. Matilda wiped her hands on her apron and went to the back door. In the narrow alley between the bakery and the harness shop next door, she found Carmen Vasquez, the blacksmith's wife, crouched beside a small figure in the shadows. The figure was a young girl, perhaps 16, with her dress torn at the shoulder and her knees drawn up to her chest. Carmen looked up when Matilda appeared. "She is safe," Carmen said quickly, seeing Matilda's expression. "Her name is Josie. She works at the Copper Penny, but not in the way those girls work. She was a kitchen helper there, washing up. But last night one of the men there decided she should be something else and she ran." Carmen's voice was controlled, but her jaw was set with a particular kind of anger that Matilda recognized immediately as the anger of a woman who has had to be careful about when and how she shows it. Matilda did not ask a great many questions. She looked at the girl and then at Carmen and said, "Bring her inside. I will make up a bath and find her some clean clothes." What followed over the next several hours was the quiet, determined work of women protecting one of their own. Carmen sent word to Hector, who would handle certain conversations that needed to happen at the Copper Penny in the morning. Matilda gave Josie the small room next to hers for the night, and sat with her while she ate bread and drank warm milk and slowly stopped shaking. Florence Bray appeared at the bakery door an hour later, having heard from Carmen, and offered her spare room as a longer-term arrangement, because Florence's rooms were in the schoolhouse building and would be safer. Ruth, who had come downstairs to find her kitchen quietly occupied by 4 women and a frightened girl, surveyed the situation without surprise and then put on the coffee pot. Chester arrived in the early afternoon, not because he had been sent for, but because he had encountered Hector coming out of the Copper Penny and had read Hector's expression correctly. He came into the bakery through the back door and found Matilda at the counter, looking tired but composed. "Is the girl all right?" he asked. "She will be," Matilda said. "Florence has her now." Chester took off his hat and set it on the counter. For a moment he simply stood there, and Matilda had the sense that he was working through something carefully. "The man who frightened her," he said, "has been firmly discouraged by Hector," Matilda said. "I believe Hector was very clear about what would happen if he made any kind of trouble." Chester nodded. A pause. "You took her in without knowing her," he said, "without hesitation." "She was frightened and she needed help," Matilda said simply. Chester looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted in a way that she had not seen before. It was not dramatic or sudden. It was like watching a door that had been slightly ajar ease gently, quietly open. "I think Dusty Creek is lucky to have you, Matilda," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the formal miss, and she felt it like a warm hand pressed briefly against her sternum. She held his gaze and said, "I think I'm lucky to have found Dusty Creek." Neither of them said anything after that for a moment. Then Ruth called from the back that the bread needed to be turned, and the ordinary day resumed, but something had changed, quietly and entirely, in the space between them. The weeks that followed were the sweetest Matilda had known in a long time. Sweet in a particular way, the way of things that are being carefully tended, that have not yet reached their full bloom but are clearly, unmistakably growing toward it. Chester began stopping by the bakery more regularly, and not only when he needed bread. He would come in the late afternoon sometimes, when the baking was done and the shop was quiet, and he and Matilda would sit on the 2 stools behind the counter while Ruth dozed in her chair in the back room, and they would talk. They talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they have discovered that the other person's company is a place they feel comfortable. He told her about Colorado, about the trail drives, about a long summer he had spent working as a hand on a ranch near the Pecos River. She told him about Abilene, about her parents, about the farm before the drought, about the years of working and moving and working again. "Do you miss having a home that stays still?" he asked her one evening. Matilda considered this carefully. "I miss the feeling of belonging somewhere," she said. the actual place I am not so attached to. I used to think that was a sad thing about myself. Now I think maybe it just means the place matters less than I thought, and the people matter more." Chester was quiet for a moment. The late afternoon light came through the bakery window at a low angle and lay across the worn wooden counter in warm gold strips. "That is not a sad thing," he said. "What do you miss?" she asked. "From before Dusty Creek." He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated, the way he gave questions the time they deserved. "The mountains," he said. "The scale of them. Out here everything is wide. In Colorado everything is tall. I miss that particular kind of being small." She smiled at that. "I have never seen mountains." "You should," he said. He looked at her when he said it, and the simplicity of those two words held a weight that she felt carefully, and chose not to examine too closely just yet, but filed away in the warm place where she had been keeping an increasing collection of moments involving Chester Ellsworth. Ruth, who was not in fact asleep in the back room but merely giving the impression of it, heard all of this from her chair and said nothing to anyone. She simply smiled at her bread cooling on the rack and let things take their natural course. In September, Denton Spar began to make himself known again. It started with small things. He stopped by the bakery twice in 1 week, both times finding reasons to linger and speak with Matilda. He was perfectly polite and perfectly well-behaved, which somehow made it more uncomfortable rather than less. He asked her to attend the church social with him, which she declined. He sent a small arrangement of flowers to the bakery, which Ruth accepted because Ruth was not going to waste flowers, but which Matilda found slightly suffocating in their intent. Spar was not a bad man in the way that some men were bad. He had not done anything she could point to and say clearly, "That is wrong." But there was a quality to his attention that felt proprietary before she had given him any reason to feel proprietorial. A sense that he had already decided she would come around, and was simply waiting with the patience of a man who was accustomed to things eventually falling into place for him. Chester noticed. He said nothing for a while, which she understood was because he was not the kind of man who spoke before he was certain what he wanted to say. But she caught the particular steadiness in his face when Spar's name came up in conversation, the way something cool and careful settled in his expression. One afternoon in mid-September, Matilda was walking back from the post office when Spar fell into step beside her on the boardwalk. He had a newspaper folded under his arm and the unhurried manner of a man who had arranged this meeting in his own mind well in advance. "I hear you have been at Ruth since July," he said pleasantly. "Have you considered what your longer-term plans might be?" "I am working on establishing myself here," Matilda said. "An admirable aim," Spar said. "Dusty Creek is growing. A woman of your capabilities should have more than a baker's assistant position." He paused, and she could feel him choosing his words with a precision that was almost lawyerly. "I find myself in need of a capable person to manage correspondence and household affairs at my ranch. The position would pay 3 times what Ruth Ellsworth can offer you." Matilda stopped walking. She turned and looked at him directly. "Mr. Spar," she said, "you are a persistent man." "I prefer thorough," he said with a small smile. "I am not looking for a different situation," she said. "I am content where I am." He studied her for a moment with those polished eyes. "The offer stands," he said, "whenever you choose to reconsider." He touched his hat and walked on, and Matilda stood there for a moment feeling the particular frustration of someone who cannot find a specific fault in a person, but finds the overall effect of them deeply disagreeable. She told Chester about it that evening, not because she needed him to do anything about it, but because she had found that telling Chester things helped her think about them more clearly. He listened without interrupting. "What did you say?" he asked. "That I was not looking for a different situation," she said. "Good," Chester said. He looked at his hands for a moment, at the work-worn knuckles and calloused palms, and then he looked up at her with those dark, steady eyes, and she could see him working up to something. "Matilda," he said. "Yes," she said quietly. "I want to be honest with you." "I would prefer that above most things," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the bakery window, the late September evening was doing that thing it does in Texas, going from warm to cool in a single breath, the light changing from gold to a deep, clear blue. "I have not been in the habit of wanting things for myself," he said slowly. "I mean, things beyond the practical. Work and the ranch and taking care of what needs taking care of. I have been, I think, more comfortable being steady and useful than being—" He stopped, started again. "I have been more comfortable on the edges of things." Matilda said nothing. She waited because she could feel that something important was being carefully assembled. "But these past few months," Chester said, "I have been finding that there is one particular place I want to be, which is wherever you are. And I wanted to tell you that plainly, because you are a plain-speaking person and I think you deserve plain speaking in return." The bakery was very quiet. The bread was cooling on the rack. Ruth was upstairs, having gone to bed early. The last of the evening light lay in a single pale strip across the floor. "I think," Matilda said carefully, because her heart was doing something considerable behind her ribs and she wanted to get the words right, "that I have been feeling exactly the same thing. And I want to tell you that plainly, because you are right that we are both plain-speaking people." Chester looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was a different kind of smile than she had seen from him before, not restrained, not careful, just open and warm and entirely genuine. It made him look younger and also more fully himself, as if this was the smile that existed behind all the others. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. They sat together for a while longer in the quiet bakery with nothing decided and everything understood, and when Chester finally stood up to go, he touched her hand briefly as he passed her, the lightest contact, and she felt the warmth of it long after he had gone. October arrived, and with it the particular beauty of a Texas autumn, clear and bright with a breeze that had lost its cruelty, the cottonwood trees along the creek going gold in the mornings. Matilda discovered that being in love, even the early tender version of it that she and Chester were carefully navigating, made the world more vivid. Colors were sharper. Bread smelled better. Ruth's chickens seemed funnier than they had before. She also discovered that being in love with a man like Chester Ellsworth was a particular kind of experience, different from anything she had imagined or read about in the few novels she had managed to get her hands on over the years. There was very little drama to it, very little of the storm and lightning quality that novels seem to favor. What there was instead was a deep, steady warmth, like a fire that had been properly built and would burn for a long time. He came to the bakery whenever he could get away from the ranch, which in October was often because the main drive was done, and the autumn work was less relentless than summer. He brought her wildflowers once, held out with a slightly self-conscious air that made her want to laugh and hug him simultaneously. She put them in a jar of water on the counter, and they stayed there until Ruth pointed out that they were beginning to wilt, which was nearly a week later. He took her for a ride out to the ranch one Sunday afternoon after church, and she saw for the first time what he had built out there in the 4 miles of grass and rock between town and the eastern hills. It was not a grand place. The house was modest, 2 rooms with a covered porch and a barn behind it and a corral where 5 horses stood looking estimably at the world. But everything about it had the quality of care. The fences were straight. The roof was sound. The porch boards did not sag. There were pots of something growing by the front door, dried herbs she thought, though she was not sure. Everything had been tended. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "Most of it," Chester said. "Hector helped me raise the walls on the barn. He is a good man to have when you need something built." He walked her around the corral, and the horses came over with the calm curiosity of animals that have been treated well. She let a gray mare smell her hand and stroked the velvety softness of the mare's nose. Chester stood beside her with his arms folded on the top rail of the fence, watching, and she could feel the quality of his attention, quiet and particular and entirely hers. "I thought about what you said," she told him, "about belonging somewhere, about the place mattering less than the people." "What did you conclude?" Chester asked. She looked at the gray mare and then at the small, well-made house with its straight fence and its careful porch and its pots of dried herbs by the door. "I think that some places and some people can be the same thing," she said. Chester was very still beside her for a moment. "Matilda," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to ask you to stay," he said. "Not at Ruth's, I mean here in Dusty Creek, specifically in the vicinity of me." He paused. "I am making a poor job of this." "You are making a perfectly fine job of it," Matilda said, and she turned to face him fully, and he was looking at her with that open, unguarded expression that still did something considerable to the region of her chest. "I do not want to leave Dusty Creek," she said. "I have not wanted to leave for quite some time, but I was waiting to be certain." "Are you certain?" he asked. "Are you?" she returned. "More certain of this than of most things I have ever been certain of," Chester said, and the simplicity of it was more convincing than any eloquence could have been. She reached out and took his hand where it rested on the fence rail, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they stood there by the corral in the October afternoon light with the gray mare watching them philosophically, and the autumn sky enormous and clear above the Texas hills, and everything was settled, quietly and entirely and without drama, in the way that the most important things sometimes are. Denton Spar became a problem in November. Not immediately, and not with any single dramatic action, but in the incremental, suffocating way that Ruth had warned Matilda about back in August, the way of a man who moves paperwork and pressure rather than his fists. What triggered it, as near as Matilda could determine, was the announcement of her and Chester's engagement, which occurred on a Sunday evening at the beginning of November, and was known to essentially the entire population of Dusty Creek by Monday noon. Matilda suspected that Ruth had assisted in the dissemination of this information, but she could not prove it, and Ruth's expression, when asked, was entirely innocent. Spar came into the bakery on the Tuesday, and this time there were no flowers and no lingering. His manner was cool and precise and different, stripped of the warmth he had been performing for the past 2 months. "I hear congratulations are in order," he said. "Thank you," Matilda said. "Ellsworth's a good enough hand," Spar said, and the slight edge on the word enough was very carefully placed. "He does not have much. A small operation. He has had some difficulty with the south pasture water access, I understand." Matilda was quiet for a moment. She understood exactly what was being said under the surface of what was being said. Chester's ranch bordered Spar's land on one side, and the creek that ran through Chester's south pasture originated on Spar's property. Water rights in Texas in 1878 were not a simple matter. They were the kind of thing that men fought over and lost operations over and left the territory over. "Is there something specific you need from the bakery today, Mr. Spar?" she asked. His eyes went cold for just a moment, then the warmth came back, thin and practiced. "Just bread," he said. She sold him his bread and watched him go, and then she went to find Chester. She found him at the livery, which was where he went when he needed to think, working over some harness repair for Sam. She sat on the stacked hay bales and told him everything Spar had said, including the exact words and the exact way he had said them, and Chester listened without interrupting, as he always did. When she finished, he set down the harness and looked at her. "He has been making noise about the water rights for a while," he said. "I did not want to worry you with it." "Chester," she said with some firmness. "Right," he said. "My apologies, I am used to carrying things quietly." "We are going to be married," she said. "I do not want you to carry things alone, that is the entire point." Something in his expression shifted, softened, and he nodded. "The south pasture water," he said. "Spar holds the upstream rights. He has the ability to claim prior appropriation if he challenges the situation. My usage has been established for 6 years, but I do not have the written documentation that a formal legal challenge would require." "Can you get the documentation?" "In theory," Chester said. "There are land records in Laredo. It would require time and, frankly, a lawyer." He paused. "I do not have the money for a lawyer right now. The summer drive went well, but there were costs, and I have been setting aside for the spring. I am not destitute, but I am not in a position to fight a legal battle. Matilda sat with this for a moment, thinking it through in the methodical way she thought through problems, which was the way her mother had taught her, starting with what is known and working outward from there. "Sheriff Prout," she said. "He has been here longer than Spar. He would know who holds what." "Abel Prout is an honest man," Chester agreed, "but he is not a lawyer, and Spar has 2 council seats." "What about the other 3?" Matilda asked. Chester looked at her. "You know, most people in your position would be telling me to let it go and find a way around Spar. Most people in my position have not spent 7 years making do and would prefer not to do it for another 7, Matilda said. "What about the other 3 council members?" They spent the better part of that evening talking through it, and by the end of it they had a plan, which was the more useful thing. Hector Vasquez was on the council. So was Franklin Deeds, who ran the general store and had his own grievances with Spar about trade arrangements. And so was a woman named Clara Whitmore, who had inherited her late husband's council seat 2 years ago, and who was, by general agreement, the sharpest person in the room at any given meeting. It took 2 weeks of careful conversations and one particularly long evening at Franklin Deeds' store kitchen with Hector and Clara, and a detailed map of the land parcels east of town. But by the end of it, they had established that Chester's water usage was documented in 3 separate county records from his first year of operation, that those records predated Spar's formal claim by 8 months, and that Spar's claim, while technically filed, had never been legally perfected. Clara Whitmore, who had a lawyer brother in San Antonio, wrote him a letter, and the response that came back in late November was sufficiently authoritative to make clear that any attempt by Spar to challenge Chester's water rights in a proper court would not only fail, but would likely expose Spar's own imperfect filings to scrutiny he would not enjoy. Clara read the relevant portions of her brother's letter aloud at a council meeting in the first week of December, with Spar present. The silence that followed was the particular kind that occurs when a man realizes that he has overestimated his position. Spar did not make any dramatic gesture. He did not storm out or make threats. He simply sat very still for a moment, and then he nodded once, and the matter was resolved. He remained in Dusty Creek because he had too much invested to leave, and he remained on the council, and he continued to buy his bread from Ruth's bakery. But he did not trouble Matilda or Chester again, and the quality of his politeness toward them both shifted from cold calculation to something more like wary respect, which was, Matilda decided, the best outcome one could realistically expect from a man like Denton Spar. Chester and Matilda were married on a Saturday morning in December of 1878, in the small white church at the end of the main street that still leaned slightly to the left. It was not an elaborate affair, because neither of them wanted elaborate, but it was beautiful in the particular way that things are beautiful when they are entirely honest. Matilda wore a dress that she and Carmen Vasquez had worked on together for 3 weeks, a dark blue wool with cream lace at the collar that Ruth had contributed from her own stores. Chester wore his best shirt and a jacket that Hector had lent him, and had to adjust slightly because Chester was narrower in the shoulder than Hector. Florence Bray played a hymn on the church's small organ. Ruth cried, which she would have denied if asked. Hector stood beside Chester, and Carmen beside Matilda, and young Josie, who was now assisting Florence in the schoolroom and had taken on a steady and settled look that she had not had that early morning in August, sat in the front pew and watched with shining eyes. Sheriff Prout was there, standing in the back with his usual economy of expression, but Matilda caught him nodding once, solemnly, which from Abel Prout constituted a considerable display of emotion. When the minister asked Chester if he would take Matilda Redmond as his wife and Chester said yes, he said it in that plain, unhurried way he said everything, the way that meant he had thought about it completely and was absolutely sure, and Matilda felt the truth of it settle over her like a warm coat. When the minister asked Matilda if she would take Chester Ellsworth as her husband and she said yes, she looked at him directly as she said it, because he deserved to see her face when she meant something completely, and the expression on his face in response was something she intended to carry with her for the rest of her life. They walked back down the aisle of the leaning church and out into the December morning, which was cool and bright with a sky so blue it looked new, and the small congregation of Dusty Creek cheered them in the dusty street, and someone had hung ribbons from the door of the Copper Penny, which even Matilda had to admit was a nice touch. Ruth had made a wedding cake, which was a significant undertaking given that Ruth usually said that cakes were a frivolous use of good flour. But she had made this one with dried fruit and spice, and it was extraordinary, and she accepted the compliments on it with the air of someone who had known all along that it would be extraordinary, and was merely allowing everyone else to catch up. They ate and talked and laughed in the bakery, which was the largest space available for gathering, and at some point in the afternoon Chester found Matilda standing at the back door looking out at the yard where Ruth's chickens were going about their small philosophical business in the pale winter light, and he came to stand beside her. "How does it feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Like something that was uncertain has become certain," she said. "Like I have found the place that is also the people." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they stood there for a moment in the warmth of the bakery door, with the December afternoon going gold around the edges and the sounds of their friends behind them. And she felt completely, fundamentally settled in a way she had not felt since she was a small girl on her family's farm in Abilene. And even then, she thought, perhaps not quite so fully as this. They went home to the ranch that evening, the 4 miles of road clear and cold under a sky absolutely thick with stars. Chester had fixed the porch before the wedding, replaced 2 boards that had begun to soften, and oiled the hinges on the front door, and there was firewood stacked neatly beside the door and a lamp lit inside because Hector had come out ahead of them to make sure the place was warm. Matilda stood on the porch for a moment before going in, looking at the outline of the hills against the star-thick sky, the dark shapes of the horses in the corral, the neat barn with its good roof. Chester stood beside her. "Welcome home," he said. She took his hand. "Welcome home," she agreed. The first year of their marriage was the most vivid year Matilda had ever lived, which she would not have predicted because it was also a year of considerable hard work. The ranch demanded it. Chester had been running it alone for 6 years, doing everything himself and managing well enough. But 2 people could do what 1 person could not, and with Matilda's practical intelligence and her particular gift for making things work, and her absolute refusal to be daunted by any problem that had a workable solution, the operation expanded in ways that Chester had previously only thought about at the edges of possibility. She kept the accounts, which Chester had been doing in his head with admirable accuracy, but which turned out to look even better on paper. She identified that they could grow their feed supply if they ran a kitchen garden of serious scale, and by April she had a half-acre of kitchen garden behind the house that Ruth came out to inspect and pronounce satisfactory, which was the highest compliment Ruth gave anything. She helped Chester think through a plan to add 3 more breeding horses to their small operation, because the demand for good horses in the county was not being met by the current supply, and the figures she worked out indicated that a modest investment now would pay considerably by year 3. Chester watched all of this with a quiet, consistent amazement that he expressed not in speeches, but in actions. In the way he always had coffee ready when she came in from the garden, in the way he fixed the handle on her garden tool before she had to ask, in the small, absolute attentiveness of a man who pays deep attention to the person he loves. They had arguments occasionally, because they were both strong-willed and honest people who care about things sometimes disagree. The arguments were short and direct and almost entirely free of cruelty, because neither of them found cruelty useful, and they always resolved into a more thorough understanding of each other than they had possessed before, which Matilda came to think of as the actual purpose of disagreement between people who respect each other. She found in Chester a depth that kept revealing itself slowly, the way a landscape does when you walk through it at close hand rather than viewing it from a distance. He had read more than she would have expected, mostly history and natural philosophy, books he had collected over the years and kept in a small bookcase beside the fireplace. He had a dry and very specific sense of humor that she found increasingly funny the more she knew him, because the jokes were always precisely calibrated to the exact thing that was most absurd about any given situation. He was patient in a way that was not passivity but genuine steadiness, the patience of a person who trusts that things worth having are worth taking the time to do properly. She also found that she had married a man who was deeply and completely good in the way that is not showy or dramatic, but simply present in everything he did, in how he treated his animals and his neighbors, and the people he encountered who had less power than he did. When a Comanche family passed through the area in the early spring, making their way east under conditions that were difficult and unjust given the increasing pressure on their lands, Chester gave them feed and watered their horses, and spoke to the older man among them with a directness and respect that Matilda observed from the porch, and that made her feel something so large she had to sit down with it for a moment after they had gone. The injustices of the time were not abstractions in the West of 1879. They were immediate and physical and present on the roads and in the conversations at the general store, and in the way certain people talked about certain other people, and in the way certain rights and dignities were given or taken based on who a person was and where they had come from. Matilda and Chester talked about these things honestly, because they were both the kind of people who needed to name things truly, and because they both believed that looking away from injustice was its own kind of participation in it. Ruth's Bakery continued to be a kind of center of gravity for their lives. Matilda went in 3 times a week to help, and Chester brought supplies from the ranch when he could, eggs and butter in the late spring when the hens were laying well. Ruth had decided, apparently, that Chester was acceptable, which she expressed by offering to teach him to bake bread, an offer Chester accepted with great seriousness, and which resulted in 3 weeks of slightly irregular loaves that Ruth critiqued with precision and Matilda ate with complete enthusiasm. In June, Matilda told Chester that she was expecting. She told him at breakfast, because she was not one for grand moments, and he sat very still for a long moment with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, and then he set it down carefully on the table and looked at her with an expression that she had no ready word for, something that was joy and gravity and something she could only describe as a profound, anchoring presence, as if he had just grown roots. "Are you certain?" he said. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. He did not say anything else for a moment. He simply held her hands and looked at her, and she could feel how much he meant it, all of it, the enormity of what was coming, the gratitude for what was already here, the steadiness of a man who understood what mattered. "We are going to need to make the second room larger," he said finally. She laughed, which was perhaps the best response to the situation, and he laughed too, and they sat there at their kitchen table in the early June morning with the window open, and the smell of the garden coming in and the sound of the horses in the corral. 2 people who had found each other in a dusty street in a small Texas town and had built, out of good faith and honest work and the particular kind of love that does not announce itself but simply abides, an entire life. The summer passed in the warm, golden way of things, when one is paying full attention to them. Matilda continued her work at the ranch and the bakery, adjusting as needed, accepting help from Carmen and Florence and Ruth, with the straightforward practicality of a woman who has learned that accepting help gracefully is its own kind of strength. Chester worked the ranch and expanded the corral and began, in the evenings, to add the second room to the house, working by lamplight when the day was done, measuring and cutting with the same careful thoroughness he brought to everything. Hector came out some Sundays to help with the heavier work, and the 2 men worked in companionable semi-silence, handing each other tools, making the occasional observation about the lumber or the angle of the roof or the state of the county in general. And Matilda brought them water and watched the room take shape, and felt something she thought might be the accumulated warmth of all the good choices she had made since that afternoon. She stepped off a stagecoach in Dusty Creek with 32 cents and a cracked leather suitcase. Their son was born in a February of 1880, in the early hours of a morning that was cold and clear and very still, with Chester holding her hand for the entire labor, which was long and difficult in the way first labors often are, and Ruth and Carmen present with the calm efficiency of experienced women. When it was over and Matilda was exhausted and entirely at peace, and the baby was wrapped and placed in her arms, Chester looked at his son with the expression she had tried to find a word for since June and still could not quite name, that compound of joy and gravity and wonder and complete, absolute love. "What shall we call him?" she asked, because she wanted him to choose, because she wanted to give him that. Chester was quiet for a moment. "Thomas," he said, "after my father." "Thomas Ellsworth," Matilda said, and the baby, who did not yet have any opinions about his name, made a small sound that might have been agreement. Ruth, from the corner where she was folding linens with great apparent concentration, said, "Good name," in a voice that was considerably thicker than usual. Thomas Ellsworth was a firm, healthy baby with his father's dark eyes, and, as Chester observed by the time Thomas was 2 months old, his mother's absolute refusal to be deterred from what he wanted. He grew with the undiscriminating enthusiasm of a well-tended thing, taking up more space and more presence in the small ranch house month by month, and the house expanded around him. The second room became his. The kitchen grew larger in a third phase of construction that Chester undertook the following summer with Hector's help. The garden expanded again, and Matilda began selling vegetables to the hotel and the general store, adding another small but consistent stream to the ranch's improving accounts. The operation was growing, not rapidly or dramatically but soundly, the way Chester did everything. The horse breeding plan had proven itself by the end of 1880, with 8 horses sold that year at good prices to ranchers and a wagon company out of San Marcos. The cattle herd was steady and well managed. They were not wealthy people, but they were solvent and growing more so, and the land was good, and the fences were straight, and there was food on the table and firewood stacked by the door, and a lamp lit in the window every evening. Matilda's life had become something so different from the years of uncertain, solitary movement that she sometimes had to stop in the middle of an ordinary moment. Some small daily thing like hanging washing in the morning light or watching Chester and Thomas in the corral with the horses, and just breathe it in deliberately, the specific reality of it, because she did not want to take it for granted for a single day. One evening in the autumn of 1881, they sat together on the porch after Thomas was asleep, which was one of their favorite times, this particular quiet at the end of the day when the work was done, and the boy was safe inside, and the stars were coming out over the Texas hills. Chester had his arm around her and she was leaning against him, and the evening smelled of the last of the summer garden and wood smoke and the dry grass smell of the grazing land to the east. "I have been thinking," Chester said. "About what?" she asked. "About the mountains," he said. "I have been thinking that someday when Thomas is old enough I would like to take him up into Colorado, show him what I grew up seeing." He paused. "Show you?" Matilda smiled against his shoulder. "I told you once that I had never seen mountains," she said. "I told you that you should," he said. "You said 2 words," she said, amused. "You should." That was the entirety of the comment. "I meant it thoroughly," Chester said. 2 words does not mean I meant it less." She laughed softly and tilted her head up to look at him, and he looked back at her in the fading evening light with that expression she had spent 3 years accumulating words for and had finally, that summer, settled on. Absolute. That was the word. Chester loved her absolutely, without reservation or performance, in the same way that he did everything else of value in his life, with complete and careful commitment, and the recognition of it never stopped being new to her. "Someday," she said. "Someday," he agreed. They sat there while the stars came fully out, one after another, until the whole sky was thick with them, the way it gets in Texas when you are far enough from town that there is nothing to dim them, and the horses in the corral moved gently in the darkness and the wind came soft off the hills, and everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. In the spring of 1882, Matilda told Chester she was expecting again. This time she told him in the kitchen where she was starting the bread, and he crossed the room in 4 steps and kissed her with such uncomplicated joy that flour ended up on his shirt, which Thomas, at 2 years old, found absolutely hilarious. The second child was a girl, born in October with dark hair and her father's serious dark eyes, and an expression that Ruth, who was present again and now 70 years old and no less formidable for it, described as a child who had already made up her mind about things. They named her June, for the month Chester had first learned she was coming, and Thomas, who had been uncertain about the arrival of a sister in the abstract, became her most devoted protector within approximately 6 hours of meeting her. Dusty Creek itself grew through these years, the way small towns in the West were growing in the early 1880s, expanding along the rail line that came through the county in 1881, and bringing with it new people and new businesses and the particular complicated energy of a place in transition. The population doubled in 2 years. There was a new church built, one that did not lean. There was a proper school building for Florence's increasing number of students, Josie now assisting her full-time, and showing a gift for teaching arithmetic that Florence said she had never encountered in an assistant. There was a new hotel, bigger and more modern than Mrs. Hargrove's place, though Mrs. Hargrove's remained the better loved of the two. There was a small newspaper, a telegraph office, and by 1883, a proper post office with regular routes. Denton Spar sold a portion of his land to a cattle company out of Austin and used the money to establish a bank, which was perhaps the most Denton Spar thing he could have done, moving from the kind of power that operated through pressure and paperwork to the kind that operated through finance. He remained a significant presence in Dusty Creek, and Matilda saw him at community events, and nodded to him, and was nodded to in return, the careful civility of two people who understand each other, and have decided that understanding is sufficient. She heard later that he had married a widow from San Antonio, a woman of independent mind and considerable property, and that she had apparently surprised him considerably in ways that Matilda found quietly satisfying to imagine. Ruth passed away in the winter of 1883, peacefully, in her own bed in the rooms above the bakery, at the age of 71. She had been slowing for several months, though she had refused to acknowledge it in any form that would have allowed other people to manage or fuss over her, and she had kept the bakery open until 2 weeks before the end. When she did take to her bed, she did it with the same decisive practicality she had brought to everything else, organizing her affairs and her wishes with precision, and then settling in to rest with an air of someone who had completed their work to their satisfaction. Matilda sat with her in the last days, and Chester came in the evenings, and Thomas and June were brought to visit, and Ruth looked at them both with an expression that was entirely love and entirely Ruth, clear and thorough and without sentimentality but completely true. "You did well," Ruth said to Matilda on one of those last evenings. "You gave me the room to do it," Matilda said. "I gave you a room," Ruth said, with a ghost of her usual precision. "You did the rest." She left the bakery to Chester, with a note in her will that said she had always intended it to stay in the family, and that Matilda had been family since approximately August of 1878. She left a small sum of money to Josie and a box of her best recipes to Florence, and she left her collection of rosemary and thyme seeds to Carmen, who planted them and kept them going for many years. Dusty Creek mourned her the way you mourn someone who was entirely herself, and made a place better just by being in it. The church was full for the service, and afterward people stood outside in the cold February air and talked about her and told Ruth stories, which was as good a tribute as any person could ask for. Matilda and Chester kept the bakery. They hired a young woman named Dora, recently arrived in Dusty Creek from East Texas, to run the daily operations, and Matilda came in 3 mornings a week to help, and to keep the place as Ruth had kept it, because some things should be maintained as a form of respect for who made them. The years settled into the particular rhythm of a life that is full and purposeful and well-tended. Thomas grew up lean and serious, with his mother's way of thinking problems through from first principles and his father's quality of steadiness. And by the time he was 7, he was following Chester around the ranch with an attention that was both flattering and, Chester said, occasionally inconvenient, because it was hard to make a mistake in peace. June grew up with strong opinions and a direct manner, and the kind of confidence that comes from being raised by people who took her seriously. And she had a particular gift for figures that made Matilda think of her own account-keeping and feel a quiet, warm pride. They took the trip to Colorado in the summer of 1886, when Thomas was 6 and June was 3, old enough to travel, still young enough to find everything magnificent. They went by stage to the rail line and by train up into Colorado, and when the mountains first appeared on the horizon, those enormous clean-edged shapes against the sky, Matilda felt something she could not entirely name, something between awe and a strange sense of recognition, as if she had been told about a thing so many times by someone she trusted that, when she finally saw it, it was both new and familiar at once. Chester was watching her face when she saw them for the first time. She knew this without turning to look, and she turned anyway, and he was watching her with that expression she had spent years collecting words for, that full, unguarded, absolutely particular expression. And she thought that of all the things she had seen in her life, including mountains, that face was still the most extraordinary. "Well," he said. "You were right," she said. "I should have seen this sooner." "We have time," he said. They did. That was the thing, the foundational, organizing fact of her life now, that she had time and she had a person to spend it with, and a place that was theirs, and children who were growing into themselves with all the surprise and delight that entails, and the wide, clear knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They spent 2 weeks in Colorado, in a small boarding house near a town called Pueblo, and Thomas decided at some point in the first 3 days that he was going to live in the mountains when he grew up, which Chester accepted with equanimity, and Matilda wrote down in the journal she had started keeping after Thomas was born, because some things are worth remembering exactly as they were said. They came home to Dusty Creek at the end of August, back along the rail line and then the stage road, and when the familiar low hills appeared and the town came into view with its leaning new church, which was actually the old church now since the new one had been built, and the cottonwoods along the creek just beginning to think about going gold, Matilda felt the uncomplicated gladness of coming home that she had, for so many years, not been able to feel about anywhere. Thomas asked, from his seat across from his parents in the stage, if they could go back to the mountains next year. "Maybe in 2 years," Chester said. "The ranch needs tending." "I will help tend it," Thomas said seriously. "You already do," Chester said. Thomas considered this, satisfied, and turned back to the window to watch the Texas landscape roll past, and June, who had been asleep against Matilda's side for the last hour, shifted and made a small sound and didn't wake, and Matilda looked at her husband across the narrow space of the stage, and he looked back at her, and the look they shared was the kind that is available only to people who have been through enough together to understand what they have, the look that says all of this, meaning everything. Meaning the children and the ranch and the bakery and the friends and the years of honest work and the mountains they had finally seen and the road home. Meaning all of it without a single spoken word. The stage rolled on into Dusty Creek in the late afternoon light, the familiar dust rising around the wheels, and Matilda Redmond Ellsworth was home. The years beyond that unfolded with the steady, layered richness of a life built on good foundations. The ranch continued to grow, modestly and soundly. The horse operation became the stronger part of their income, with Chester developing a reputation in the county for reliable, well-trained animals. A second barn went up in 1887, and by 1888 they employed two hands, brothers named Paulo and Diego Reyes, who had come north from below the Rio Grande, and who proved to be skilled and dependable and gradually became part of the extended family of people that orbited the Ellsworth Ranch. Thomas, at 9, 10, 11, was the boy his parents had tried to be careful not to make assumptions about, but who consistently surprised them by being almost exactly the person they had quietly hoped he might be. He was not perfect. He had a temper that arrived suddenly and departed quickly, and he had inherited Chester's tendency to go quiet when troubled, which Matilda addressed by being precisely the kind of person Chester had needed her to be in their early courtship, someone who sat with him in the quiet and waited with a patience that was not passive but entirely present. Thomas began to talk when he felt someone was genuinely there to listen, and she learned his interior landscape the same way she had learned Chester's, slowly, attentively, with great respect for the terrain. June at 6 and 7 and 8 was a different kind of child entirely, outward where Thomas was inward, quick where he was deliberate, loud where he was quiet. She talked to everyone and had opinions about everything, and had already, by the age of 8, informed both her parents that she intended to run the bakery someday. Matilda found herself thinking of Ruth when she looked at June, not because they were alike in the obvious ways, but because both of them had that quality of absolute clarity about what they thought and what they valued, the refusal to be vague about important things. Hector and Carmen Vasquez remained among their closest friends through all these years. Hector's blacksmith business had expanded into wagon and equipment repair, and he served on the town council, and he had the permanent, satisfied air of a man who has built a good life in a place he chose deliberately. Carmen's herb garden was legendary by the mid-1880s, supplying not only the bakery but several households and the new hotel's kitchen. They had 3 children of their own, older than Thomas and June, and the families moved through each other's lives with the ease of long familiarity. Florence Bray had married a quiet, bookish man named Arthur who came out to Dusty Creek in 1882 to teach alongside her, and who had apparently solved the specific problem that Florence had not known she had, which was the need for someone who could keep up with her in conversation. They had 2 children and a house full of books, and an atmosphere of productive intellectual engagement that Matilda found enormously entertaining to visit. Josie, now fully grown and confident in a way that the frightened girl in the alley in 1878 had only barely suggested, had married Paulo Reyes in 1885 in the leaning old church, and by 1888 lived half a mile from the Ellsworth Ranch with their daughter and a second child on the way, and a steadiness that seemed to have been built not despite everything she had been through, but partly because of her own decision to endure it. Sheriff Prout retired in 1887 and was replaced by a younger man named Garrett Cole, who was good-natured and energetic, and managed to keep Dusty Creek orderly with a combination of firm principle and personal likability. Prout himself moved into a house on 2nd Street near where Ruth's bakery had been, and was seen most mornings sitting in front of it in a wooden chair, watching the town go past with the same close attention he had always paid it, no longer professionally obligated but apparently incapable of stopping. The bakery was doing well under Dora's management, and Matilda's 3-morning-a-week presence gave it the continuity of Ruth's original vision. She had expanded the bread range to include things Ruth would have considered frivolous, sweet pastries and spiced rolls, and a particular apple cake that became well known enough that people from other towns specifically stopped at the bakery when passing through Dusty Creek. She kept Ruth's original recipes in the same battered notebook Ruth had used, and she kept the Ruth recipes and the new recipes in separate sections, which felt like the right balance. One November evening in 1889, when Thomas was 9 and June was 7, the four of them sat down to supper in the kitchen of their ranch house. The expanded, well-lit kitchen with its good stove and its window that looked out toward the barn. And it occurred to Matilda, in the way these recognitions come, all at once and completely, that she was inside the center of the life she had once, as a young woman moving from town to town with a cracked suitcase and 32 cents. Barely allowed herself to imagine. She put it to Chester that evening when the children were in bed, sitting by the fire with the lamp turned low, the way they often spent the end of the day, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, sometimes simply being in the same room in that particular ease of people who have become each other's primary landscape. "I want to tell you something," she said. Chester looked up from his book. "All right," he said. "I am very happy," Matilda said. "I do not think I say that directly enough, and I want to say it directly, because you deserve to hear it directly. I am completely happy." Chester looked at her for a moment with that expression she had long since given up trying to find words adequate to, and had learned instead simply to feel. "I am as well," he said, with his characteristic economy, which in his particular case meant it as deeply as anyone could mean anything. She reached across and took his hand, and he closed his book and held hers, and they sat by the fire in their ranch house with the winter wind moving softly outside, and the children asleep in their rooms, and the horses quiet in the barn and the stars doing their extravagant business overhead. And the full, settled reality of it surrounded them on all sides, warm and permanent and complete. Dusty Creek continued to grow into the 1890s, changing in the way all towns change. Some things lost, and some things new, and most of what mattered remaining if you knew where to look for it. But the ranch 4 miles east of town remained what it had been since Chester had begun building it, a place carefully made and carefully tended, and the two people at the center of it remained what they had been since a July afternoon in 1878, which was plainly, honestly, thoroughly in love, in the way that does not diminish with time but deepens, the way a good fire builds on itself. They did go back to Colorado, as Thomas had wanted. They went 3 more times over the years, and each time Matilda stood at the foot of the mountains and felt that same compound sensation, awe and recognition, and a particular quality of smallness that Chester had once described as the thing he had missed most. And each time she turned to find him watching her face, and each time the look they shared was the same look they had shared across the stagecoach that first time, full of everything that had passed between them and everything still ahead. Life in the West was not without its hardships. There were years when the rains failed, and the cattle prices dropped, and they sat over the accounts together, and worked through the numbers with the methodical calm of two people who had learned to navigate difficulty without panic. There were seasons of illness and seasons of loss, and the particular grief of watching the older people they loved become older still and eventually pass. But through all of it, the foundational thing held: the partnership, the honesty, the deep and unperformative love of two people who had chosen each other fully and had never, not once, had cause to regret it. June did eventually take over the bakery, at the age of 19, after training under Dora and Matilda both, bringing to it the sharp practical mind and the absolute clarity of purpose that had been visible in her since she was old enough to have opinions. She ran it with such effective energy that within a year it was supplying 3 times the businesses it had under Ruth, and she did it without losing any of what Ruth had built: the smell of good bread, the warmth of the front room, the sense of a place that fed people in more than one sense of the word. She married a gentle, thoughtful man named Will, who had come to Dusty Creek as a printer's apprentice and stayed, because he found that he could not leave with any peace of mind, and they had 3 children who grew up running in and out of the bakery with the casual confidence of children who have always known where home is. Thomas's love of mountains did eventually take him north, as he had declared at 9 that it would. He went to Colorado at 17 to work on a ranch, and returned at 23 with a wife named Clara. Not the councilwoman Clara, but a different Clara, one with copper hair and a laugh that could be heard 3 rooms away. And he brought her home to Dusty Creek the way his mother had once arrived there, stepping off the stage into the dust and the heat, and looking around at the small baking town as though taking its measure. Matilda watched Clara look at Thomas, and recognized something in that look so precisely and completely that she had to press her lips together to keep her expression composed. Thomas and Clara settled eventually on a piece of land adjacent to his parents, and the Ellsworth name spread further across the county, and there were more children and more noise and more suppers around extended tables and more horses in more corrals. And all of it had its beginning in that July afternoon, when Chester Ellsworth had leaned against a barbershop post with a tin cup of coffee and noticed a woman standing in the street with a suitcase and said, without drama or particular ceremony, "You look like someone who just got some bad news." Chester was still doing things like that in 1895, in 1898, into the first years of the new century. Still noticing. Still saying exactly what needed to be said and no more. Still making the coffee when Matilda came in from the garden. Still fixing the things that needed fixing before they were asked. Still holding her hand across the kitchen table in the morning light with the complete, unfussy tenderness of a man who considers this the central fact of his life and conducts himself accordingly. Matilda Redmond Ellsworth, who had once stood in the street of a strange town with 32 cents and no plan, looked at her life in its full and present complexity, at the ranch and the bakery and the children and the grandchildren beginning to arrive, and the friends who had become family and the husband beside her, who had never once been anything other than exactly who he was. And she held all of it in her mind at once like a thing she had built with both hands, which was exactly what she had done. She had built it out of practicality and courage and willingness to stay, out of the decision to call a thing home when it was home, and to love a person fully when they deserved to be fully loved. She had built it out of the 32 cents, and the suitcase, and the cracked letter, and the flour on her apron, and the July heat, and the blue dress she had married Chester in, and the sound of Thomas's first cry and June's first determined opinions, and the warmth of the fire on winter evenings and the stars over the Texas hills, and all the cups of coffee and loaves of bread and mornings before dawn and the steady, uncountable presence of a man who loved her absolutely, and whom she loved in exactly the same way. The cottonwood trees along Dusty Creek were going gold again in the autumn, as they always did, as they had every autumn since she had arrived in that baking July 13 years and more ago. The wind off the hills carried the dry grass smell that she had come to associate with home more than any other single thing. The horses moved in the corral. Smoke came from the chimney of the house. The lamp was lit in the window. Chester came out onto the porch where she was standing and stood beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and they looked out at the late afternoon together, the way they had stood looking out at any number of late afternoons over the years. And the comfortable, absolute warmth between them was the same warmth it had always been, only more, the way a fire that is well tended grows, adding to itself without consuming itself. "What are you thinking about?" Chester asked. Matilda leaned against him and looked at the golden cottonwoods and the clear sky and the hills going purple in the distance. "Everything," she said. Chester held her a little closer. "Good everything?" he asked. She smiled, full and unhurried and entirely genuine, the smile of a woman who has found what she was looking for and built what she needed and loved well and been well loved, who has lived an honest and purposeful life in a place that is entirely hers. "The very best kind," she said. And the evening settled around them, warm and full and complete, in the way that the very best things are, the things that have been tended carefully and given time and chosen, freely and daily and without reservation, over and over again.